Hi everyone, we are Johnny and Roberta from Synchronicity Center for Modern Mindfulness and Awakening, and we'd like to welcome you to episode 3 of Introduction to Practical Buddhism and Mindfulness Meditation. This series is intended to give you an easy to understand overview of core Buddhist philosophy and provide you with simple tools to apply it to daily modern life.
So, the last episode, we went into detail in explaining all of the different types of truth there are, and how their understanding can help with grasping the true nature of reality, and many of the core Buddhist concepts that we will be exploring in this series. So today, as a continuation on the subject of truth, we will introduce you to the Buddha's Four Noble Truths, which are in fact the core of the Buddha's methodology and the very foundation of what he realized at the time of his awakening, or enlightenment, almost 2,600 years ago.
As a reminder, please subscribe to our channel, follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and if you are at all able to support the work we are doing with Synchronicity Center, as we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, please consider making a small donation through our website, synchronicitycenter.org. So let's get started.
Great. So as we mentioned in the first episode, all those years ago, Siddhartha Gautama was searching for the answers to all that troubled him about the human experience and the world around him. It finally led him to spend days in sitting meditation, looking into his own mind for insight to these answers. It was at that time that he experienced his enlightenment and true seeing of the nature of reality. What eventually transpired with his sudden awakening and seeing was clear and concise knowledge into the true nature of the human condition. These principles he outlines in his teachings are most commonly referred to as the Four Noble Truths, or it could also be translated as the Four Truths for those that would be noble. Now, it's important to understand that these Four Noble Truths form the core of all Buddhist paths and traditions, and there are many of them.
Not surprisingly, due to Siddhartha's comprehensive upbringing and education, he introduced his new findings in the form of how a medical practitioner would diagnose and treat a disease state in a patient. And hence, during his introspection, he devised 4 truths that were first relayed as such. 1. Diagnosing the problem. 2. Identifying the underlying causes. 3. Determining the likely prognosis or likely outcome. And 4. Prescribing a course of treatment. These simple, direct statements help for us to gain a clear understanding of the nature of reality, the nature of suffering, and in the end, help us to reduce the suffering we experience during this human experience. And we're talking human reality, not ultimate reality.
So, this is how that medical practice translated for the Buddha. Now, we'll list them all for you and then dive a little deeper into examples of each one. So, to start, Noble Truth number 1 is the truth of suffering. And that is known as the word dukkha in the Pali language. In life, there is suffering, or simply suffering is. Another very practical way our teacher Noah liked to put it to understand easily is, in life, difficulties will arise. And the second noble truth is the truth of the causes of suffering. And this translates from the word samudaya in Pali. Now, essentially, he observes that there are identifiable causes to the suffering we all experience in life. And then the third noble truth is the truth of the end of suffering. And in Pali, this is known as Nirodha. Now, basically, this states that the causes of suffering can be ended. And the fourth and final noble truth is the truth of the path that frees us from suffering, or leads to the cessation of suffering. And that is translated from the word magga in the Pali language. Now, we give you the terms in Pali informationally, as you may hear or see them in other Buddhist contexts, so it's nice for you to know and understand what's being referred to.
So the first noble truth, the truth of suffering or dissatisfaction, or in life there is suffering, or suffering is, or difficulties will arise, and as we mentioned in Pali, as dukkha. Essentially, it can be summarized in this way. What we need to consider is that life has this funny or uncanny way of unexpectedly interjecting and creating problems, obstacles, and many unanticipated events. Especially when we think that everything is under control and going smoothly. But then here comes life, with its way of presenting even the most happy and peaceful among us with earth-shattering surprises. Some of those surprises are huge, like a loved one dying, a global pandemic, losing your only source of income, getting in a terrible car wreck, finding out you have a terminal illness, or even worse, that one of your children is ill. And some of these difficulties are less severe, more indirect, less obvious events and situations that occur on a day-to-day basis, or over a long period of time, such as how the normal aging process produces aches and pains you never had before, the frustrations of getting caught in unexpected traffic, waiting in line for what feels like forever at the DMV, or your pen running out of ink at a crucial moment, and every single other pen you pick up is also out of ink.
Happens to me so many times.
Every single one of these extremes, from the most serious to the most subtle, are ways that suffering manifests in our lives.
So, simply acknowledging the fact that at any given moment we may face some type of uneasy or uncomfortable experience will help give you an understanding of this noble truth. We never know when or exactly what will arise, but when it does, we can certainly know that it was eventually expected. This embodies the essential lesson of the first noble truth. We know that sometimes terrible things happen in life. Things are never going to go smoothly 100% of the time, as much as we wish they would. But we truly need to recognize that all levels of suffering and difficulties are just simply a part of life. No matter how organized you are, or how great you are at planning, or even how good of a person you are, every single one of us still doesn't always get what we want, and we still often get stuck with what we don't want. It's just entirely unavoidable.
So what the Buddha is trying to teach with this first noble truth is that life is going to be easier for us when we truly understand that suffering and difficulties are a part of life. It is something that is universal among all of us. There's absolutely no way to skirt it or get around it. It doesn't matter what we possibly do, but we absolutely cannot avoid the sudden and unexpected difficulties, hardships, and surprises that will eventually come our way.
And inevitably. So, a great example of this could be for you to imagine that when you were a kid, you and your friend were just walking down the street and came across an abandoned house and decided to have a look inside. Now, probably not one of the best of your ideas, but you go inside anyway. So you're exploring the house, room by creepy room, and as you both round the corner of a hallway, someone in a spooky clown mask jumps out of a closet at you. Now, you would no doubt be startled, frightened, or even more like terrified. And you would most likely scream at the top of your lungs and run away. I mean, let's face it, clowns these days are pretty creepy. But now, imagine that it is actually Halloween night, and that abandoned house is actually a haunted house that you pay money to enter. Now, before going inside, you know that you are going to encounter spooks and surprises at any given moment. You just don't know exactly what or when they are going to happen. But when one of these surprises finally happens, you will surely be startled still and maybe even let out a little scream, but not nearly as much as you would and with as much terror if you didn't know to expect it.
So we can apply this same principle to life. If we go through it without ever expecting to encounter major or minor surprises, such as global pandemics, losing your job, terminal illness, death of a loved one, getting stuck in traffic, the long lines, the pens running out of ink, etc., then when they do come, we are taken aback and much more dramatically affected by them. And we have a harder time dealing with them, or the simple fact that they even happened. The first noble truth is about understanding that these surprises will most definitely come, but we just don't know when. So now let's talk about what suffering is. Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines suffering as the state of undergoing pain, distress, or hardship. But if we take a closer look, we'll find that there are actually several different types of suffering.
So, it is important to distinguish between the three main types of suffering. Just as we had all different categories of truth in our last episode, we will find a similar scenario with types of suffering. So, the first type of suffering that we will encounter is natural suffering, also known in Buddhism as the suffering of suffering. Now, we don't control this type of suffering. It is natural and normal, and we can experience it on a pretty regular basis. It is not a suffering that we can avoid. Pain may be a good way to categorize it. It's the kind of suffering we experience when we hit our funny bone, stub a toe, or break a nail.
Ouch.
Or even when we stay up all night being ill with the aches and pains of the flu or even COVID-19. It could even be the minor and major aches we begin to feel as we get older and begin to develop arthritis. It is overall the kind of pain that most of us feel and would associate with things like birth, illness, injury, old age, and death.
Very good. Then we have the second type of suffering, the suffering of loss or change. That is what we experience, for example, when we lose a job, a loved one, or even our youth and vitality, or possibly even a cherished material possession. This form of suffering is also natural and normal, and very much like the suffering of suffering. This type of suffering is often connected to very specific circumstances.
Then we have the biggie, the third type of suffering, known as all-pervasive suffering. This is the third type of suffering that practical Buddhist philosophy is most concerned with, and can work most dramatically with helping to alleviate. And it is known as all-pervasive suffering. Now, unlike the first two types, this is the self-inflicted suffering that we bring upon ourselves. And it generally arises out of an ignorant or delusional understanding of our current reality or situation. Now, it could also arise out of attachment to our ideas, concepts, or even material things. But either way, it usually has very little to do with our actual circumstances and a lot to do with how we perceive and interpret those circumstances.
So the suffering we experience while we are naturally upset and sad at having broke up with our girlfriend or boyfriend is normal and healthy. But the self-inflicted suffering we add to this experience by kicking our car and breaking our toe, or going home and getting overly drunk and then drunk dialing our phone,
I don't know who's done that before.
or even just allowing our minds to constantly replay the scenario over and over again and mentally beat ourselves up over it. This is not healthy, and it's not natural. Much of our self-inflicted suffering is brought on by our habitual reactivity. It stems from our inability to pause between stimulus, what happens to us, and our response, how we react to what happens to us.
The Buddha often equated the problem lying with how we react to suffering in one of his teachings found in the Samyutta Nikaya, where he says, quote, "When touched with a feeling of pain, the ordinary uninstructed person sorrows, grieves, and laments, beats his breast, and becomes distraught. So he feels two pains, physical and mental, just as if they were to shoot a man with an arrow, and right after, to shoot him with another one, so that he would feel the pains of two arrows." And that's from the Samyutta Nikaya 36.6.
So think about it in relation to this parable. In life, we can't control the first arrow that was shot and over and done with. However, the second arrow is our reaction to the first. You may have heard that pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. We are known to constantly shoot ourselves with the second, third, fourth, and fifth arrows, etc., as we continually rehash, replay, and ruminate over whatever happened with the first arrow, replaying the incidents over and over again and causing us so much more pain and suffering. Other examples of additional arrows could be self-proclaimed mental statements such as, "There is something wrong with me,"
Right.
"I am not good enough," "I've failed," or "Why do these things always happen to me?" Basically, all of the mentally beating yourself up for any given situation.
So now we move on to the second noble truth, the truth of the causes of suffering, known as samudaya. What we will soon begin to realize is that the causes of suffering lies not in events or circumstances, but in the way we perceive, interpret, and react to our experience as it unfolds. Essentially, suffering emerges from our craving or desire for life to be other than it is, or for the cards that we've been dealt to be an entirely different hand. What we will begin to understand, especially in the coming episodes, is that life is impermanent and change is constant. Many times we grow frustrated when the world doesn't behave the way we think it should, or when our lives don't conform to our expectations. Think about it. In a constantly fluctuating and changing world, our instincts are to search for something permanent and reliable, such as a greater meaning or a destiny for which to seek continuous shelter and security within.
So the irony with this strategy is that it turns out to be the very cause of what seeks to rid itself of. In wanting for our suffering to be relieved in such ways, we actually emphasize what creates the suffering in the first place. The desire for life to be other than it is. Eventually, we will find ourselves spinning in a perpetual circle. The more critical the suffering, the more we want to get rid of it. The more we want to get rid of it, the more critical it gets.
Exactly. So the second noble truth is when the Buddha reveals to us that there are three main causes to our suffering. And these are known in Buddhism as the three poisons. And they are habitual actions relating to what we experience that are so deeply seated in the mind that they have the ability to figuratively haze or even poison our minds.
So collectively, the three poisons are ignorance, desire, and aversion. First, we'll talk about ignorance or delusion. Ignorance is the inability to see the truth about things, that all things, including and especially the self, are impermanent and interdependent. And we will get into much more detail about this in our next episode. But for now, just know that this can be one of our biggest delusions about reality. Then we have desire or greed. We think that if we get the things we want, such as money, fame, power, a new car, a bigger house, a better job, etc., that we can avoid suffering. And then finally there is aversion or anger. We have it in our minds that if we can avoid the things we don't want, such as illness, old age, death, traffic, and long lines, we can also avoid suffering.
Now, it's very important to understand that none of us are alone in our suffering. Everyone experiences the entire spectrum of suffering, and absolutely no one is immune to it. The essential lesson of the second noble truth is acknowledging that all conditions are bound to change, as we will also soon learn in the next episode, because all things are impermanent.
So with this in mind, we can approach each moment with a bit more clarity and confidence, somewhat easing into it rather than resisting it or being overwhelmed by it. We have the ability to look at each experience we encounter in this big game of life and just recognize that this is the experience that is only happening in this moment, and know that the very next moment we experience will be something totally new and different, and then the next moment, and yet again another, and so on.
Recognizing the inevitable change and impermanence of our experiences is the key to the beginning of alleviating all of the suffering we experience in life.
So this brings us to the third noble truth, the truth of the end of suffering, or nirodha. Essentially, this translates that the causes of suffering can be ended. The third noble truth helps us to understand that in the cessation of suffering, it's not the suffering that ceases, but rather our craving not to suffer that ends. In other words, you don't actually end suffering.
Right.
Suffering is an unfortunate but true lifelong reality. But we can let go of our attachment to avoid suffering, which paradoxically causes us so much avoidable suffering.
Now, of course, this can be a complicated concept to grasp, as it is quite paradoxical. We can't just do away with our craving not to suffer by simple force or will. In fact, when we consciously try to attempt to no longer attach to it, we're now clinging or attaching to the idea of not clinging. Think about it. If we desire not to desire, we are still trapped by our desire. We can't just say, okay, from now on, I won't cling or attach to anything. And this is obviously because the causes and conditions that give rise to attachment and clinging will still be there.
But here's the real pearl of wisdom to be found here. Letting go of desire, aversion, and attachment can be achieved through the practice of mindfulness.
Yes. So a great example of how we can do this is thinking about a situation where you're driving on the highway and you get cut off by a driver in another car. like this doesn't happen to all of us at some time or another. Most of our obvious emotional reactions would be anger, or maybe even rage. But if we can let go of that initial habitual reaction, along with the stories that we create in our heads about that driver, and allow ourselves to understand that we really just don't know what's going on in that car. It is possible that the driver could just be a jerk, or he may be on his way to the hospital for his sick child. Now, if that was the case, we would not experience the same emotional reaction of anger or rage to this rude driving behavior. But either way, we can instantly become aware of and begin to observe our likely emotional reaction of anger that we are feeling inside. And through mindfulness, we can ask ourselves, as we are observing the emotion of anger, is the observer of this emotion also angry? It is in that moment that we may be able to distinguish between the emotion we are experiencing and the observer of the emotion.
This mindful pause that we create can allow us to stop and see the reactivity unfolding before our eyes. It is in that moment that the emotion of anger can no longer have a grip on us. We are able to see the emotion of anger as separate from ourselves and allow the emotion to just be what it is. And it will eventually pass. You can think of it as, yes, you are experiencing the emotion of anger, but you are mindfully choosing not to react to it. And you are not your emotions. You are not anger. You are therefore liberating yourself into not being shot by that second, third, fourth, or fifth arrow of pervasive suffering.
So the essential lesson of the third noble truth is that the limiting ideas and stories we create about ourselves, others, and every other experience can be unlearned through the diligent practice of mindfulness.
And this leads us now to the fourth noble truth, the truth of the path that frees us from or leads to the cessation of suffering, known as Magga in Pali. The fourth noble truth teaches us that for us to bring an end to suffering, we need to work towards beginning to see and experience the world as it truly is. We need to gain an understanding that our current perspective and perception of reality is mainly based on the many illusions or even delusions that allow us to view these constructs that we've created as our ultimate reality. But with mindfulness, training, and unlearning, we can cut through these habitual reactions and dualistic perspectives, and this will enable us the chance to bring an end to much of the suffering that we and others experience.
So within the fourth noble truth, the Buddha proclaims to us that there is a way or a path to end the causes of suffering, or in other words, craving for life to be other than it is. First and foremost, we need to abandon our expectations about the way that we think things should be and begin to develop mindfulness and awareness about the way things really are. But as always, proper perspective is the key to success in this effort. Many times, the untrained mind believes that the way we see things is the way they truly are.
But in essence, when we are mindful and aware, and we take the time to look at the way we see things, the way we see things changes. That's why it's so important to take time to really, really look at the way we see things. Once again, we do this through the practice of meditation, mindfulness, and following the essence of the Buddha's fourth noble truth, the Buddha's Eightfold Noble Path.
Now, we will cover the Eightfold Path in depth in one of our next episodes, as well as covering the important concepts of impermanence and interdependence. But essentially, just to give you a little preview, the path is often referred to as the path of liberation, or the path to the cessation of suffering. Others may call it even the middle way. And even another way some may like to describe it is like the mind skillfully walking the razor's edge between stimulus and response.
Now be sure to subscribe and tune in to our next episodes for a true practical breakdown of this path, as well as important insights and explanation of the key concepts of impermanence and interdependence. But just to give you a little preview, the 8 parts of the path can be grouped into 3 essential categories of Buddhist practice and training.
So, we have wisdom training, or panna in Pali, and this encompasses the steps of right understanding, also known as samadhi, and right intent, also known as sammasankappa. The next category encompasses ethical conduct, translated as sila in Pali. This encompasses right speech, or sammavaka, right action, or sammakamanta, and right livelihood, translated from samma-ayiva. Finally, we have the third training on the path, in mental discipline. This encompasses right effort, samavajama, right mindfulness, samasati, and right concentration, known as sammasamadhi.
And one final note regarding this preview of the path is that it isn't meant to be followed in a sequential order. All 8 areas are developed simultaneously in an ongoing way. They are all linked in the sense that each one helps with cultivation of the others. Hence the reason that it is often represented in a wheel format with 8 spokes, representing the 8 areas of concentration, and is sometimes called the Wheel of Dhamma, or the Dhamma Chakra. Regardless, know that just walking the path is an ongoing process that can bring about a new sense of awareness and perspective in our lives, and truly change the way you view and relate to the world around you.
So, we hope you learned something new in this 3rd episode. Keep an eye out for episode 4 very soon, where we plan to introduce you to important concepts of interdependence and impermanence. These concepts are integral in your understanding of other core Buddhist concepts, including the details on the steps of the Noble Eightfold Path. All of this will once again help to lead you to a true and practical foundational understanding of many of the subjects yet to come in core Buddhist philosophy and practice. And soon enough, we will be getting into teaching you actual mindfulness meditation practice.
So feel free to post any questions in the comments, and we will try to answer those questions in subsequent episodes. And also, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and check out our website, synchronicitycenter.org. Sign up for our newsletter to keep up to date with all the new things we are up to.
And while you're there, if it is at all within your means, please feel free to just contribute a small tax-deductible donation. Just a little bit. Via our PayPal or Facebook donate buttons, as it will truly help for us to produce more content like this in the future and support all of the work that we are trying to do. But otherwise, thank you all so much for joining us today, and we will leave you with our own wishes of loving kindness or metta for you today. May you all be happy, may you be well, may you be safe and free from suffering this day and every day.
Thank you.